The auto industry picked a fight it thought it could win. Instead, it may have just handed right to repair its biggest victory in years. And I think the media is covering this story backwards. Here's what's going on. This week, the mainstream media covered President Trump signing a presidential memorandum expanding Americans' freedom to repair their own vehicles. This happened just after Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis CEOs went to Washington, D.C. to convince President Trump to sign their version of the Right to Repair Act. Their goal is to control who repairs your cars because it has become one of the most profitable money streams for the auto industry. But President Trump did sign something to expand Americans' freedom to repair their own vehicles, but not the version the brands wanted. Then shortly afterward, on Friday, July 3rd, President Trump granted full pardons to multiple mechanics and individuals who were convicted for fixing their own cars. Most headlines focused on those actions individually. They missed the bigger story. The real story is the auto industry's effort to preserve control over vehicle repairs backfired and produced exactly the opposite result. The media is acting like the right to repair suddenly appeared out of nowhere. But this is a huge story I've been following for a while. So let's rewind a bit, because this didn't start at the White House. It didn't even start in Washington. It started years ago, and if you've been watching this channel, you've heard me talk about it before. Most people think the right to repair is about people changing their own oil or replacing brake pads in their driveway or a water pump or pulling an engine. Well, that's a small part of it, but it's never been the real fight. The real fight has always been about something much more valuable: control. Control over who has the information from your vehicle. Who controls that? Who controls the software? Who controls who gets to repair the vehicle after you've already paid for it? And once I put all the pieces together, well, this one goes really deep. But let's just pause really quick, because I want to remind you to like, subscribe, and click that bell for notifications, because this story was not over with yet. A few years ago, Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly approved right to repair. It sounded simple. If you own a vehicle, you should decide who repairs it, whether it be your car dealer, your neighborhood repair shop, or a national repair chain, or maybe you like working on the vehicle yourself. Most people thought the debate was over. It wasn't. It had just moved behind closed doors. This is where lobbyists came in. Lobbyists are clever. They move quickly, and the conversation changed almost overnight. Suddenly, no one was talking about replacing alternators or changing spark plugs anymore. Now it was about telematics, all that stuff in your center screen, vehicle data, cybersecurity software, and connected cars. The entire argument shifted, and that's important because it wasn't by accident. Here's what almost nobody tells motorists. I've worked on all sides of this industry long enough to know how the business really works. Dealerships don't make the bulk of their money selling new vehicles. The real money comes after the sale, when you need service, parts, maintenance, diagnosis, even software updates and warranty work is money for the car dealership. That's the engine that keeps the business running. And here's another fact most people don't know. Dealerships have never serviced every vehicle they sell. They couldn't, even if they wanted to. There simply isn't enough service bays or technicians. There never has been. And you and your friends probably would be waiting weeks to get on the schedule. That's how hard it is to get an appointment these days. Here's something you probably didn't know. For every 100 cars that are sold, only 30 of them go back to the dealer for service, maintenance, parts, etc. And 70 go elsewhere. So they only have 30% dealer retention. They want a higher retention. In other words, they want all their customers to come back, even though you're waiting, like I said before. And that's where the money is. That's why the automotive aftermarket and all those repair shops and all those repair chains that you see, they make a lot of money, and the car manufacturers would like to have it. For decades, a large percentage of repair work has naturally gone to independent repair shops, service chains, fleet maintenance providers, and owners who simply enjoy working on their own vehicles. That's the system. So let's ask a different question. If the automotive repair ecosystem has worked that way for generations, why did this suddenly become one of the biggest lobbyist battles in Washington? I don't think this was ever really about changing your oil. This is about something much bigger. Modern vehicles aren't just mechanical anymore. They're computers on wheels. Every year, they generate more software and more data, more connected services and subscriptions you pay for, more opportunities for manufacturers to stay connected to the vehicle long after it leaves the showroom. Now, to be fair, some of that is genuinely good. Modern vehicles are safer than ever, and cybersecurity does matter, and no one wants someone hacking into their vehicle. Those are legitimate concerns. But here's where the story started to change. The more I dug into this, the more I realized the debate wasn't really about safety anymore. It was about access to your software and the diagnostic information, access to the data that now is required to repair modern vehicles. And that's when I started wondering if this was really about protecting consumers. Why was everyone fighting so hard over who gets access to the information? Because that's exactly where the story headed next, straight to Washington. And then I thought it went the way the auto industry expected. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know this wasn't some overnight fight about who repairs your car and what the government can or can't control. I've been talking about the right to repair for years, and Massachusetts wasn't the beginning. It was simply the first place most Americans noticed something had changed. But after voters approved right to repair, a lot of people thought the debate had settled. But those of us in the industry knew it wasn't. It just moved behind closed doors. It was hidden, out of sight and out of mind, into committee rooms, legislative offices, meeting, and with lobbyists. And here's what caught my attention. The public debate sounded almost identical everywhere. It's about safety, cybersecurity, consumer protection, and protecting connected cars against hackers. Those sound like good arguments, but modern vehicles are incredibly sophisticated. They're loaded with electronics and advanced driver safety systems, over-the-air software updates, connected services. Nobody wants someone making unsafe repairs, and nobody wants hackers accessing vehicle systems. Those are legitimate concerns. So let's give the auto industry the benefit of the doubt for 1 minute. If that's really the concern, why wasn't the conversation focused on technician training or certifications? Why wasn't it focused on expanding access to qualified independent repair shops? I think you know the answer to this. Instead, the fight kept coming back to one thing: access. Access to repair information, diagnostic software, telematics, and special tools. Access to data of modern vehicles that generate every second they're on the road. But I realized something. This was never really a fight about who could replace a water pump. It was becoming a fight over who controlled the information needed to repair the vehicle at all. That's a very different conversation. And then another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Most people have probably never heard of H.R. 7389. You don't need to remember this bill number. But here's what matters. One of the biggest battles wasn't over parts. It was over telematics, the wireless data flowing between your vehicle and the manufacturer. And that data that we're constantly talking about has increasingly helped diagnose problems, perform software updates, calibrate safety systems, and determine how modern vehicles are repaired. Independent repair advocates argue that without meaningful access to that information, right to repair becomes increasingly difficult as vehicles become more software dependent. And much of that is controlled by each automaker, and that's the future of vehicle repair. Then something else happened. I covered when automakers took a trip to Washington, D.C. They spoke directly to President Trump in the Oval Office, photo ops and all, looking like heroes to customers. That wasn't a surprise to anyone because industries meet with lawmakers all the time. They explain their concerns, they advocate for their position, and that's part of how government works. But this meeting was different because the conversation wasn't just about regulations, it was about ownership. Who controls a vehicle after it was sold? The manufacturer or the person making the monthly payments? Then Ford CEO Jim Farley made comments that got a lot of attention, and not the good kind. He argued that consumers shouldn't repair modern vehicles because of safety and cybersecurity concerns. This from a guy who's considered a car guy? I was shocked by the statement, and online, people had a huge reaction to that, and not a good one. Again, those concerns deserve to be taken seriously. But why? Independent repair shops service millions of vehicles every day, and ASE certified technicians repair advanced electronics every day. I'm ASE certified as well, but insurance companies, municipalities, and any other organization with a vehicle fleet rely on them. They're not asking for shortcuts, they're asking for access. Access to the same information increasingly required to repair the vehicles consumers already own. And that's where I think the conversation started heading in a direction that the auto industry wasn't expecting. Because from everything that followed, I don't think President Trump was asking the same questions they came to answer. The industry was talking about protecting the repair system. The White House started asking questions about protecting vehicle owners. Those aren't the same conversation. President Trump even mentioned people he knew who were talented mechanics. And a few days later, the answer came. The White House changed the conversation. President Trump signed a presidential memorandum called Lowering the Cost of Living by Promoting the Freedom to Fix. Now, here's the interesting part. Most of the headlines treat it like another political press release. I actually sat down and read it. And there's a lot more than just a title of a presidential memorandum. You have to read the details because that's what truly matters. And what it said wasn't what I expected. The memorandum doesn't create a brand new right to repair law. It doesn't rewrite the Clean Air Act. What it does is something much more interesting. It tells the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to start removing barriers that have made it harder and more expensive for Americans to repair the vehicles they already own. I like that. But looking deeper, one of the first things the memorandum does is direct the EPA to clarify what repairs Americans can legally perform on their own emission systems without violating federal law. So think about that. If the federal government has to clarify what you're allowed to do to a vehicle you already own, that tells you just how complicated this issue has become, or how complicated car brands wanted it to become. Then it goes a step further. The memorandum tells the EPA to encourage new certification pathways for aftermarket emissions parts instead of relying almost entirely on California's certification process. We have talked about CARB, the California Air Resources Board, which has been hindering car brands and car repairs for decades. Now, that may sound like a highly technical issue. It isn't. If one certification process becomes the bottleneck for the entire country and parts take longer to reach the market, competition decreases, and that means prices go up and customers have fewer choices. I think that was the goal of not just CARB, but the car brands. The memorandum specifically calls out those concerns. Then came the part that really caught my attention. The administration directed the EPA to consider deprioritizing civil enforcement against people who, in good faith, repair their own vehicles back to their original configuration or help others. The federal government wasn't talking about making repairs harder. It was talking about making them easier. I like that. That's a nice surprise from the federal government. Because this wasn't the conversation that the auto industry had been having. For years, the discussion centered around limiting access in the name of safety, cybersecurity, and emissions compliance. Now the White House was talking about affordability, consumer choice, competition, and freedom of repair. Then I started thinking about something else. If this was simply another routine policy announcement, why did it happen immediately after the auto industry had been in Washington, D.C. making its case? Maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe, but the timing certainly got my attention. And then the story took another turn. President Trump issued pardons to several individuals who had been convicted of federal emissions-related cases involving vehicle modifications and aftermarket tuning. Now let's be clear about something. Those pardons involve specific federal cases and are separate from the presidential memorandum. They're different legal actions, but taken together, they tell something very important. The administration wasn't making one isolated decision. It was sending a message. The federal government's approach to vehicle ownership and repair was changing, and whether you agree with every one of these decisions isn't really the point. The point is that in the span of just a few days, the conversation shifted. They stopped being a debate between automakers and independent repair shops and diagnostic tools or a discussion only mechanics cared about. It became a national conversation about car ownership. Who decides what happens after you buy a vehicle? The manufacturer or you? And I couldn't help but think back to Massachusetts because that's exactly where this whole thing started. Consumers said they wanted a choice. The industry said the issue was safety. Lobbyists went to work. The fight moved to software. Then it moved to Washington, and now it's reached the Oval Office. And I don't think that's where anyone expected the story to end. The only problem is I don't think it's ending at all. Because once I stepped back and looked at everything together, I realized this investigation wasn't really about right to repair anymore. It had become something bigger, much bigger, that impacts everyone. What do you really own? This was never really about changing your own oil. It was never about replacing brake pads like I've said before. And honestly, it wasn't even really about the Right to Repair Act. The right to repair was simply where consumers first noticed something had changed. The real fight has always been about ownership. For more than 100 years, buying a car meant something pretty simple. You bought it, you drove it, you maintained it, you fixed it, and you decided who worked on it. If you wanted to keep it for 20 years, that was your decision. And if you wanted your neighborhood mechanic to repair it, that was your decision. Maybe you wanted to spend your Saturday under the hood with a wrench in your hand. That was your decision as well. And no one thought twice about it or told you could or couldn't do something. Today, the definition of ownership is changing. not because someone passed one law or a company made a decision, but because vehicles themselves have changed. Today's vehicles are connected, they're software driven, and they're constantly generating information and data on you and your life. And there's a lot of money to be made there. And we see all these data centers, like I've constantly been covering, they're collecting that data and they're making money on it. Your car is receiving updates automatically, then communicating it to the car manufacturers. None of that is automatically a bad thing. In fact, a lot of it is making vehicles safer, more reliable, and easier to repair. And technology isn't the villain here, at least not in this argument. Control is the issue. But I realized something. 20 years ago, if a manufacturer wanted to influence repairs, they controlled the car repair manual. You couldn't buy one. Today, they can control the software. Tomorrow, they may control access to the vehicle itself. That's a very different relationship between a manufacturer and a vehicle owner. And I don't think that most Americans have really thought about this. So here's something I keep coming back to. Nobody buys a $60,000 pickup thinking they're purchasing a temporary license to use it, or buy a family SUV believing someone else should ultimately decide where it gets repaired. Consumers believe they're buying property, their property. That's always been the understanding. And that's why this fight matters. Not because everyone wants to rebuild an engine, because most people don't. Frankly, most people won't work on their own cars, but people simply want a choice. The freedom to go back to the dealership or support an independent repair shop they've had in their town for 30 years that they really like this guy and they want to go back to him. The freedom to buy quality aftermarket parts and to repair the vehicle they already own. Competition has always been good for consumers. It pushes prices down and improves service. It rewards businesses that earn your trust instead of assuming they have it. Take away meaningful competition, and customers always pay a higher price. That's true in almost every single industry. It's certainly true in this one. So where does this go from here? Honestly, I don't know, but Congress will continue debating the Right to Repair Act in every industry, not just automobiles. The courts will continue hearing the cases and manufacturers will continue making their arguments, and independent repair shops will continue making theirs. Technology isn't slowing down, and neither is the debate. But here's what I do know. This week changed the conversation. For years, the Right to Repair Act was treated as a niche issue, something for mechanics or car enthusiasts or independent repair shops. Now it's sitting on the president's desk. That tells me this isn't a niche issue anymore. It's become a national conversation about ownership, competition, and consumer choice. Whether you agree with every decision that was made this week isn't really my point. My point is that the auto industry went to Washington, D.C. believing it was defending the future of vehicle repairs for themselves, not for you. But instead, it may have done something very different. It may have accelerated the biggest right to repair victory we've seen in years. And if that's true, this definitely won't be the last time we talk about it. It'll be the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one where the question isn't who should repair your car. The question is, when you buy a vehicle, what does the ownership actually mean? Because if we can't answer the question, every fight over software, every fight over car subscriptions, over vehicle data, over remote features, and every fight over repairs isn't really the same fight. It's a fight over who controls your car after you already paid for it. And I'll keep following the story because I have a feeling we're just getting started.